Good evening. Welcome to Keep Calm and Fanny On, the many careers of Fanny Cradock. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this event. Some of you, like me, are probably of an age where you do remember Fanny Cradock on television, though I mostly remember her post cooking career, so I'm actually going to be really fascinated to hear about her real career. Kevin has written a book on Fanny. He's also got a blog on her and a Facebook page, and he's doing a PhD on the history of TV cookery. So he's going to be a great guide to the career of Fanny. If you've got any questions, please post them in the chat. You'll see a bubble on the top right of your screen. Okay, over to you, Kevin.
Thanks so much, and hi to everyone at home. Hi from Edinburgh. It's quite dark and gloomy tonight in Edinburgh, but hopefully a little bit of Fanny Craddock will cheer us all up. So as Nikki said, hopefully everyone here has at least heard of Fanny Craddock. She's the kind of person that once you've seen or heard her, it's quite difficult to forget her. Most people think that they know her and they know her career. They kind of associate her with different aspects of life. So if you play a word association game, if you say Fanny Craddock, people tend to tell you a number of things, such as the joke about doughnuts, such as that she always cooked on TV wearing ball gowns. People talk about her appearance a lot, so they describe her eyebrows in great detail. People tell you that she invented the prawn cocktail. Some people, and most people, I guess, remember her downfall on TV linked to Gwen Troke, or supposed downfall. We'll come to that later. People will tell you that she was horrible to her assistants and people that she cooked with on screen. People always tell you that they remember her cooking with her husband, Johnnie, on TV. And perhaps people will tell you that she hated when people referred to her wrongly or misspelt her name. It's Craddock with one D, and she used to write nasty letters to people, anyone, in fact, who mentioned or in print or in talk that she had two Ds in her name. So it's Craddock with one D. So tonight we're going to look at some of the reality, I guess, behind these myths, behind these associations. People remember rightly that Fanny Craddock was a television cook, and she cooked on TV for over 20 years solidly. So you would expect that people would remember that. However, there's much more to her life and her career than just TV, and that's what I'm going to introduce you to tonight. Just before we get started looking at Fanny's own career, just a really brief introduction to her background, her history, and it's relevant, and you'll probably see later why it's relevant when I discuss her own career. So Fanny's father was an author, a playwright, a poet, a bit of an entrepreneur, if you like. He loved writing, but he also loved gambling, and he became bankrupt while Fanny was very young, and plunged their family into a life without much money, really. Her mother was named Bijou, and she was an actress. So you see that perhaps from an early age, Fanny Craddock was surrounded by theatre, surrounded by that kind of life, fantasy. Her own name gave a little nod to perhaps how things would be in the future. She was born plain old Phyllis, but her full name was Phyllis Nan Sortain Primrose Pesci, or maybe Peachy, if you're of the age that you can remember Hyacinth Bouquet, or was it Bucket? It's very similar. Fanny says that she didn't have a happy childhood. She had a strange relationship with her mother. She felt that her mother didn't want her. She had a brother, and she felt that the brother was the favourite in the family. It would seem that her mother had some mental health issues, although that's not how things were described back in 1909 when Fanny was born. Fanny was brought up mainly by her grandmother, who she adored and who loved food and who loved colour. Her grandmother would make sure that everything in her house was colour coordinated, including the food. Her favourite colour was pink, not one of Fanny's favourite colours, but the coordination seemed to stick. One thing that people tend to remember about Fanny is that she was married several times. Her first wedding was at age 17, and sadly her husband died while she was pregnant with her first child. He was an RAF pilot, and his plane crashed, leaving Fanny just about to give birth and on her own. She quickly married another few times, actually, and not very successfully, and had another child. She spent a great number of years trying to look after her children on her own and doing a series of dead-end jobs, anything from cleaning to selling vacuum cleaners door to door and making Swiss rolls at the Ideal Home exhibition, for example. Nothing quite brought enough fame and fortune into her life to enable her to look after her children in the way that she wanted. So sadly, she gave her children back to the father's families to look after and carried on with her career. I've included some pictures here in this first slide of her father and some of her father's books. He wrote under several names. His real name was Archibald Thomas Pesci or Peachy, but the main name that he was known under was Valentine, and he wrote endless novels and plays, including a successful play called Tons of Money. Not something that he ever had himself. Another pseudonym that he used was Mark Cross, and he wrote 40 or 50 novels under that name too. He was a constant writer and producer of books, something that Fanny would take on board in her later life too. When her father wrote his own autobiography, he didn't even mention that he had a daughter, never mind Fanny's name, just to give you a little glimpse of perhaps what life was like at home. He mentions his wife, but again, he doesn't mention her name. He does mention his son a couple of times, but really his autobiography is entirely about himself and only about himself. Again, perhaps something that we might recognise in Fanny Craddock in later life. Fanny's career story really started after World War II. During the war, she lived in the country with her husband, Johnnie. In actual fact, they weren't married, but they lived as if they were married in the country. After the war, they moved back into London and they secured a property in South Kensington, just near to the museums and galleries in South Kensington on South Terrace. They were able to secure the property fairly cheaply after bombings had destroyed much of the area, and they set up home there and tried to set up a life. Known as Mrs. Craddock or Phyllis Craddock during that time, Fanny worked hard to integrate herself into South Kensington society. So her first venture there was as an activist, a protester, mainly about food, but standing up for housewives and issues that were important to housewives. After all, she was the quintessential housewife herself with her well-to-do husband, Johnnie Craddock. She very quickly joined the British Housewives League and was actually promoted to be the head of the at least the Kensington branch. Perhaps it was because she had the loudest voice, or perhaps it was because she had a knack of securing publicity and such like for the events that they planned. She knew how to snare in the press, if you like, perhaps from her father's work. He was similarly very good at attracting publicity. Some of the publicity that she attracted was with the BBC, who liked to interview the protesting housewives of the time, very similar to the protests, I guess, that are going on around the country at the moment. With her flair for marketing and publicity, Fanny Cradock was able to secure changes to food rations and rights for housewives to access food in Britain. And she also became addicted, if you like, to events and publicity and making something of herself. Perhaps she'd finally found a career that she could take to and do well in. This career quickly led her to working for newspapers. So I mentioned that her father was someone who wrote endlessly. So did Fanny Cradock. She found that she had a really engaging voice and really engaging way with words. People liked what she wrote. So she started off writing newspaper columns, primarily about anything and everything. And she had a different persona for each type of article that she wrote. She wrote about making evening gowns and hats. You can see in the pictures here some of the things that were around that she did in her articles. So from scraps of material, she would fashion something marvellous for people to wear. She wrote under the name Elsa Frances, which was a pseudonym that she picked. Elsa was a friend of hers. Frances was her grandmother's name. So she put the two together and wrote quite a strong output under that name. But it wasn't the only name that she wrote with at the time. She used the name Frances Dale to write about cookery, and she had her own kitchen column in the Daily Express. She drew upon all sorts of experience from her previous employment. She'd worked for a while in a dressmaker's. She wasn't very good at what she did, but she was good at attracting customers. She was good at attracting attention. She also wrote fantasy articles for newspapers, primarily about Atlantis and notions of science fiction, things that perhaps we don't connect with Fanny Cradock. But her main output was about food and opinions based on the work that she'd done with the Housewives League. From her work in newspapers, she started writing children's books. And you can see in the pictures here, they were elaborate, colourful, well-illustrated books for children. She started writing them for children that she knew. By this time, her own children were not in her care and were living with their father's families, and she had no contact with them. Perhaps it was a way for her to reach out and stay connected to her own children by writing about children. They were illustrated by the top illustrators of the day, and she published most of her books under the name Frances Dale during that time. There's about 10, 12 endless amounts of different books that she published. One book she published under the name Susan Lee. She always chose different names, and we don't know why, but we think perhaps it was just because her output was so huge. She couldn't possibly publish everything under one name or her own name. Most of her children's books were based in enchanted worlds and featured fantasy characters, mainly animals who came to life after dark. So it's kind of like Toy Story, but many, many decades before Toy Story was there. So they were toys and animals who came to life and entertained the children who perhaps were alone or frightened, was the main theme that came through in her books. She started to include details from her own life, but of course these were hidden in her public life, but included in the books that she wrote. So the characters in the books took on the names of her own children, of her neighbours, of her own family, and sometimes used examples of real life experience from her own life within those books. She also wrote historical books for children based on biblical narratives. Just anything really, I think, that would sell well and that would hook in publishers, she was keen to publish. She also followed in her father's footsteps and wrote a huge amount of fiction. She chose the name Phyllis Craddock here, which was the name she was known for as an activist. So her real name, Phyllis, and her real married name, if she had been married at the time, to Johnnie Craddock. Again, she used her flair for marketing, publicity, and anything that she could really to ensure that the books sold well. So you'll see in the screen here, one of her books is called Gateway to Remembrance, and it's set in the lost world of Atlantis. She claimed at the time that she didn't even write the book herself. She said that it was dictated to her by a high priest of Atlantis who had died 9 million years previously. And she refused to accept any royalty payments, she said, for this book because it wasn't written by her. She merely sat at the typewriter and typed the words that were dictated to her. At the time, this kind of science fiction, science fantasy was really popular in novels after the war. People were looking for escapism. Writers like Aldous Huxley were very popular and published actually by the same publisher as Fanny here. So she tried to hook in to that life, that way of writing and that style of book for her own publications. She also wrote a huge amount of books under the name Frances Dale, and they were more crime fiction, again, fantasy-based, featuring characters who lived a huge life of privilege. But again, like her children's books, they contained many hidden details of Fanny's own life. So she was creating a persona of herself in real life, which was very different from the real life that she'd had. But within the books, we can find details of the actual life that she had through her characters. So some of the characters were married several times. Some of them had children that they couldn't look after. Some of them hooked up with majors from the army who also left their wives and families to be with their loved ones. And all these things were part of Fanny's real life, but not her real public life, if you like. She started to write cookbooks too, no surprise. Her first books were published under the name Frances Dale. Her publisher advised against writing cookbooks, but it was something that she was passionate about. And she said to her publisher that if her cookbooks didn't sell, her first cookbook, she would stop writing them. But of course, she had a plan to make sure that they sold very well. Her first book there, The Practical Cook, contained some really strange and eclectic recipes. Her recipe for baked hedgehog, she claimed, was one that she used during the war when food was very scarce and rationing meant that usual meats really weren't as available. She included recipes for roast cygnet, which even at the time would have been quite illegal to make, but caught the headlines and ensured some publicity. She also included recipes that were perhaps not traditionally British, so recipes for pumpkin pie and other American dishes were included in her books too. And she started a pattern with her cookbooks in these first two cookbooks that she continued for the rest of her life. So the first book is very basic and contains the kind of ideas and techniques that you would need to get started with cooking. And then her next book was for the more ambitious cook. So it was more aspirational. And I guess if you'd bought her first book, of course you would buy the next book because you wanted to show that you were learning and that you were quite ambitious too. She coined the term a culinary ladder, and she was going to take you on a journey up it by teaching you the golden threads of cookery. She claimed that she'd learned to cook in France by watching prestigious chefs at work in their kitchens. We're not quite sure if this actually happened or was just part of her fantasy, her persona, but it's a story that she stuck with for the rest of her life. She'd been taught to cook, she taught herself to cook by watching masters at work. She also published many cookbooks with Johnnie Craddock, and they tended to be under the name Bon Viveur, which was a name that they worked together under. I have to say, if you read the books, you'll wonder, what was Johnnie's role? Nobody really knew. He tended to be in charge of wine, but the books are very much written in Fanny's voice, and it's clear that she wrote them. Around about the time that the books on screen here were published, Johnnie and Fanny were appearing together on television. So these books connected the television programmes. And also, if you look very closely, you can see that they connected products that they advertised and promoted together, such as polyfoil wrap, which features prominently in the Request cookbook. So Fanny was joining Johnnie and promoting products, and the links through advertising were really successful for both of them throughout her life. And again, it's that theme of publicity, marketing, and anything to drive sales of her cookbooks. She connected lots of people together to do that. Again, with Johnnie, she produced many more books. So throughout her life, Fanny probably published in excess of 100 books. Some of those books were travel books. Bon Viveur was the name not only of their cooking partnership, but Fanny and Johnnie wrote restaurant reviews and travel columns in newspapers. And they also produced many books and guidebooks from their travels around Britain, but also around Europe. One of the books that I'm showing here on the screen is written by Frances Dale herself, and it was a trip around Europe in a car, which would have been quite exciting in the 1940s when the book was published, but also quite strange for a woman to be travelling and to be writing about her travels in Europe. All the travel books that they produced together featured food, whether it was the best places to eat or what to buy at the market while you were there. There was hints on shopping and the best places to buy the best products. Of course, where to source wine that you couldn't get back at home in Britain. And where to go sightseeing and to be active while you were there. They also included some strange references to learning local phrases that might help you while you were there. I'm not sure that any of the phrases that Fanny chose. They're very Fanny Cradock phrases, but perhaps they were helpful to people who were holidaying in places like Sweden or in Nice, for example, another place that she wrote a book about. So Fanny's main career, and I guess the career that she's most fondly remembered for, is on television as a cook. And she started to broadcast in the 1950s with the BBC. She originally started doing some radio broadcasts based on her travel work and her trips to Europe. So her first broadcast on radio as part of Women's Hour was a reminiscing type article about her trip to Italy, where she fondly remembered the doughnuts and the sun, and she evoked quite a scene to encourage people to travel abroad. Her first television appearance came about partly by accident. She was keen to do more radio work because she knew that by being on the radio and reaching millions of houses throughout Britain, that they might buy her books and read her columns in newspapers. So she wanted to reach as many households as she possibly could. At the BBC, she hadn't really thought about television. It was a new medium, not something that she'd considered. Wasn't fully available all over the UK for people, so was something that she initially dismissed. However, people at the BBC encouraged her to look towards television, and she created some unusual presentations for her first shows. The picture you can see where her and Johnnie are holding trays is from her first television appearance. So she wanted it to be quite spectacular and grand. She dressed up. It was in the evening. They made elaborate dishes. And Johnnie was there as her helper, as her assistant. So a real role reversal in the kitchen. Fanny was in charge. Johnnie was the bumbling assistant who couldn't really cook, and she would show him how. During the 50s, she also performed spectacular television cooking demonstrations, and she performed in front of an audience of between 2,000 and 5,000, depending who you believe and whose publicity you believe, at the Royal Albert Hall. She pitched the idea for the BBC to show the entire show from the Albert Hall. And it's a show that you can see today if you look on YouTube and other places. The BBC weren't keen to show the whole show, but they did show a segment of it live from the Royal Albert Hall. And it really secured Fanny's future in TV because the cameras cut to Fanny and she didn't miss a beat in being able to broadcast her 5-minute segment during her hour-long show at the Royal Albert Hall. And she produced some spectacular dishes on cue. She knew where the cameras were, the lights were, etc. She worked really, really well on television, and she was asked to do more. During the 50s, she did a range of broadcasts aimed at housewives, teaching housewives to cook, cooking shows for children. She did shows for deaf children, so her visual abilities came to the fore. She wanted to recreate her kitchen at home in the television studios, and she wanted to have her husband by her side to help her. The BBC weren't so keen on all of these things initially. So Fanny went to work for ITV for a while, and she found a happy home there where advertising and product placement was something to be encouraged and not shunned as it had been at the BBC. She still had a flair for marketing and publicity, anything to generate additional sales. And in 1955 or 56, she became part of a show which was beamed across Europe. It was actually part of the early Eurovision contest, not the singing contest, thankfully, but the Eurovision cooking contest. And it was a duel between her and a French chef who claimed that women couldn't cook. Fanny was determined that she would go up against him on a kind of MasterChef style competition and show the country, show Europe, but show men that women could cook. And she created a kind of glamorous persona to go with that. She knew that the French chef would appear in his chef's whites, and she wanted to stand out. So she wore elaborate gowns designed by Norman Hartnell and designers who worked for the royal family. She made the most of her connections with products and used them as part of the competition, and also advertised them in newspapers and columns that she wrote to, but also on screen. In the 1960s, Fanny Cradock moved back to the BBC. She clamoured to get back to the BBC. She knew that that's where the biggest audiences were. However, the BBC weren't as keen to have her back. They saw her as someone who was too linked to products and advertising from her time on ITV. In 1965, they asked her to audition for a new show, and she was brilliant, according to the notes at the BBC archive. She was hard to fault. She had a real connection with the camera. She was able to demonstrate food, cooking, talk at the same time, and do everything on time. She was a very efficient television presenter. However, they didn't really like her very much, and they tried very hard to replace her, and that's why they made her do the auditions. They auditioned 25 other people to hopefully find someone who could take her place, but they couldn't find anyone who could do it as well. She continued at the BBC after this first return back, again building on the ideas that she'd put in place with her early cookbooks of starting series that looked at the basics of home cooking and turned to more adventurous ideas in the next series, looked at some of the problems that people had in cooking in the next series. So she was forever hooking viewers and audiences back in to come and join her for the next series of cooking. She updated her style and appearance on every series. She prided herself on being very fashionable. So you can see that by the 60s, the ball gowns had gone, but the high fashion remained. She pestered the BBC to let her do some cookbooks to accompany the series that she was producing. The BBC initially were a bit unkeen to do that because their focus was not commercial. However, once she started to produce books and they sold in excess of 150,000 for each print run, they quickly saw that it was a popular idea and something that they could also run with too. Something that we take for granted today. Television cooking programs and their associated cookbooks seem to go hand in hand, but not before Fanny Cradock came on our screens. The advent of colour TV was something which seemed perfect for Fanny Cradock. She loved colourful food, and she was herself obviously a colourful character. So being able to demonstrate her food and show amazing colours and the colour in her life too was something really important towards the end of the 1960s for Fanny Craddock. She cooked successfully on TV every year. She had a different series of around 12 to 15 programmes in a series, but they were being repeated and then new series were coming on stream too. She continued her basic, advanced style of cooking. She continued to show people how to climb that culinary ladder by giving dinner parties, by impressing bosses, and by weaving in some of the golden threads that they'd learned along the way. She linked very well to social and cultural changes during the 1960s and seemed to chime with audiences who just wanted to see more and more of her. By the 1970s, she was well established on TV, and she continued to have idea after idea after idea of how things could be improved and presented. She'd always wanted to cook from her own kitchen at home, and the BBC had always said it was too expensive to send an outside broadcast crew there. In the 1970s, she realised her ambition, and she built a studio kitchen in her home, which the series Fanny Cradock Invites was subsequently filmed in. So if you, again, go on to iPlayer or YouTube and watch that series, you'll have a good look around her home. She very proudly shows it off. But also, she wanted to do travel programs which included food, and also programs which highlighted her legacy, because again, these were ideas that she could use to sell more and do more, really. Also in the 1970s, she was thinking about an exit plan. She'd been cooking on TV for 20 years. So similar, I guess, to people like Nigella Lawson, Jamie Oliver today. She'd been a constant presence on TV. And, you know, she was looking for a retirement plan. She looked at things like a weekly part work, which was produced in full glorious colour every week, stuffed full of recipes, which took on board her history, her legacy, but also introduced her to new readers and new people. The marketing and publicity surrounding the part work was immense. And the people who published it felt that it was an ideal opportunity to make a lot of money, both for Fanny Cradock and for themselves. Advertising and product placement, again, within the part work, was something that Fanny worked really hard to achieve. Towards the mid and end of the 1970s were the times that she drew her television career to an end. So she'd started to feature, instead of on prime time in big series that carried her name, she appeared in cooking slots and other programs like Nationwide. And she produced the now infamous, but at the time quite overlooked, Craddock Cooks for Christmas programme, which appeared in afternoon time slots in 1975 and really was a kind of greatest hits of Fanny Craddock's Christmas cooking. She was a bit tired of the repetition and a bit upset by the shift in her scheduling, but she did what she could to maintain her presence and persona. She updated her image and tried to be quite funky in the 1970s and to remain relevant. She was always cooking up ideas of how she could increase sales and marketing. You gather that there's a theme, I guess, in what I'm talking about. She produced brochures that were sent out to food producers, telling them how much money and sales they could make for them. They produced a huge amount of advertising material for companies, and always, I guess, credited the companies in every way, because she had lifetime contracts with some of those companies, and she wanted by this point in her life to make the most of those associations. She had a great passion for teaching younger people to cook and passing on skills, and she felt that she could regenerate herself in this role. Here's an early example of some work that she did with a young woman called Sarah, who she trained to cook and trained to be, I guess, a replacement for herself in future life. You might recognise Sarah as the hapless assistant in the Craddock Cooks for Christmas programmes, which came later. She had a range of assistants that lived and worked with her at home, and she trained them in how to be cooks, how to perform on TV, and she had an idea to try and franchise them out so that she could benefit from her own legacy while developing some new careers, but continue to have those people cooking in the Craddock format, perhaps with the Craddock name, but without appearing herself. Those ideas never quite happened in the 1970s. Maybe they were too radical at the time, but you could see that they might happen today. During the latter part of the 1970s, Fanny and Johnnie appeared together on lots of game shows and chat shows and really had some fun looking at the lighter side of entertainment. And this is where most people remember seeing them, on the Generation Game or Celebrity Squares, or on chat shows like Parkinson and the like, that were really massive during the 1970s. Also, during the 1970s, Fanny agreed to appear on a programme called The Big Time, which again is something that people remember. People say it was the end of her career. It was in part the end of her career, but not because of how she was and the story that's often portrayed. She wanted it to be the end of her television career, and she was already planning to move things on in some way. So she accepted the role on The Big Time that we see. If you remember The Big Time, it featured a Devon housewife cook called Gwen, who was cooking an elaborate dish for a very elite set of guests, and Fanny was there to advise her and to judge her menu and to help her improve. The episode was called Gwen Choke's Banquet, but subsequently has become known as the Gwen Choke Incident. Fanny was quite disparaging about some of the choices that Gwen made, and the presenter and producer of the show, Esther Ranson, capitalised on this and made it into quite a shocking programme, where it looked as if Fanny was quite rude about Gwen Choke and generated a fair bit of publicity and sales, both for Gwen Choke but also for Fanny Cradock around it. The famous story is that Fanny Cradock's contract at the BBC was cancelled as a result of this show. I have to say that she never had a contract at the BBC to cancel. And actually, the story with Gwen Choke is much more complicated. You can see on the screen here some newspaper clippings, etc. So Gwen herself first came into the limelight in 1970, so 6 years before the Big Time show. She won a competition producing a champion sandwich. She also met and worked with Fanny Cradock in 1972 when Gwen Choke entered the Cook of the Realm competition, judged by Fanny Cradock and Esther Ranson. And she cooked duck in bramble sauce in 1972 for this competition, which was the famous dish that she cooked in 1976 on BBC screens. Esther Ranson knew that Gwen and Fanny had a certain dynamic and that it might look great on TV. Esther remains a big fan of Gwen Choke, and you can see that Esther endorsed Gwen Choke's own cookbook, which was published shortly after the TV show. The reason that Fanny wanted out of TV work, I guess, was that she knew she was getting a little bit older. Things were getting a little bit more difficult for her, and she wanted to return to writing. She had a huge appetite for writing. She could write endlessly, and she wanted to return to being an author, sort of like her friend Barbara Cartland. She created books that were huge, sweeping family sagas, and she had an idea that perhaps they would be turned into soap operas or films. The books themselves are very much Downton Abbey meets Dynasty, and she really created a niche for herself. She also created a whole new successful career. You can see that her books here were published under the name Fanny Cradock, which was the first time she had done so. She found a tax loophole which enabled her to move to Ireland and work tax-free for 10 years as a new author because she hadn't been published as Fanny Cradock before. So it was quite lucrative to her, or would have been if it had worked out to plan. As I come to the close of my presentation, I just want to look very briefly at a return to the screen for Fanny Cradock in the 1980s. Again, she wanted to capitalise on her legacy and produced a huge series of huge cookbooks, which included all the recipes from her career and her life. Again, in that familiar format of beginners, more ambitious and more elaborate books to come. She started to cook again on TV, and she joined TVM to cook some dishes, but it was really difficult for her. Things had moved so quickly in TV. They weren't the studios that she was used to working in. She wasn't presenting foods that she was used to doing, and she wasn't used to someone speaking to her while she did it. She went back on chat shows, and she appeared famously on Wogan, which she seemed to really enjoy, and less so on the Jonathan Ross show, which she didn't enjoy, primarily because Jonathan Ross simply found her funny and laughed at her and was fairly rude to her. She didn't have a very pleasant experience, but she rejoined that kind of celebrity circuit, if you like. So, just to bring the presentation itself to an end, I hope that I've been able to show you that Fanny's legacy is more than ball gowns and eyebrows and jokes about donuts. She had a huge, tremendous amount of output, both in writing, on screen, and in contribution to how things are viewed and done now. If you want to read her books, as I say, she's published over 100, so you'll be there for some time. She cooked solidly on TV for 20 years and produced, I guess, the kind of blueprint for television cooking shows that we see today. She linked successfully together marketing and publicity around herself, around her celebrity, around her work, to increase her own sales and to ensure that she continued to work. I've put here just some brief links of places that you can look for more information about Fanny Cradock, and these links will be sent round after tonight's presentation, so you'll be able to look at them in your own time. If you do want to read more about my research with Fanny Cradock, the book that I published is on the screen now with some details there too. But for now, I'd be really happy and hope that you have many questions around the many careers of Fanny Cradock.
Wow, thank you. That was amazing. Like I'm sure a lot of people out there, I had no idea about the publishing career. So that's, I'm sure there's quite a few questions about that. Yes, just to say to people, the links that are up on the screen at the moment, everybody who booked through Eventbrite is going to get sent them afterwards, including a lot of links to YouTube clips, and there were some shows on the BBC iPlayer as well. So that we didn't show clips because I know if you've, I'm sure quite a lot of you have watched a lot of these sort of events over the last year. And if so, you'll know that clips, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. You can never quite tell. So, but there are clips available to see out there. Okay, quite a lot of questions, and they're still coming in, so please do keep them coming. I guess the first question somebody has asked is, yeah, the Eurovision chef competition, who won?
Well, it's a good question, and it's something that Fanny herself disputed, again, probably for publicity. So it was pitched as a male versus female competition. There were 3 judges, 2 of which were male, and funnily enough, the 2 male judges voted for the French male chef, and Fanny had 1 vote from the female judge, which she said was rigged and not in her favour. She claimed that she cooked the best dishes of the night, and she claimed that she won even though she didn't win. So officially, I think he won, but unofficially she claimed herself to be the winner.
I mean, I suppose this leads to a question. I mean, how do you think she rates as a cook? I mean, do you cook her stuff?
Yeah, I mean, people often say, and one thing that I should have mentioned, people often say, but she couldn't cook. She didn't know how to cook, and her food was terrible. Well, I've been cooking her recipes on my blog for the past 8 or 9 years, and I've never found a recipe that didn't work. She was incredibly skilled with techniques, however she learnt them. She had some strange combinations, and she tended towards fanciful colours and presentation. But I think that she was a good cook, and that she knew and understood food really well. But she was a bit eclectic, and she liked to collect recipes from history, from people that she knew, and from books that she'd read, and she borrowed them and used them a lot. But I think that genuinely she was a good cook, and you can see on screen most of the TV shows that she produced were filmed in 1 take, and she cooked maybe 5 or 6 dishes in 15 minutes. And I would defy anyone who thinks that someone who can't cook could do that on screen. So I would say yes, she was a good cook, and from my own experience, her recipes work really well.
So that's fascinating. She's not like just pulling things out that she's prepared earlier, because obviously I know some TV chefs, that's what they have to do, isn't it? They have to have them ready at different stages.
Yeah, she did a little bit of that, but most things were cooked, if not in real time, but as if in real time, and then she just moved on to the next dish. You won't see edits in her shows, and you won't see things go wrong, really. Very little did go wrong on screen, but she had a backup plan, and sometimes those were things that she prepared earlier, but usually it was things that she just finished off on screen as well, and pointed you back towards her cookbooks, where you'd find the full recipe and the full details of how to do that. So she wanted you to watch her and learn, and then buy her books.
Yeah. Someone says that the other TV cook they remember from the 60s is Zena Skinner. So how do they differ? Were they rivals? I guess that just, I mean, what does she think of other TV chefs? How does she feel about, because I mean, Delia was sort of coming up in the 70s. How does she feel about her?
Yeah, that's right. So when Fanny herself started cooking, the main TV cook at the time was Philip Harbin, and he cooked on TV with Marguerite Patton. So they were her contemporaries, and she set out, I guess, to be entirely different to them. So Philip Harbin was quite a portly gentleman who cooked in a butcher's apron and was quite traditional. Margaret Patton styled herself as if she was a housewife, with flowdy aprons and was a bit, as she became a home economist and a national treasure. So Fanny wanted to be glamorous and different. And I guess that's the main difference between her and Zena Skinner. So Zena was a more down-to-earth cook and described herself in those terms. Zena was really popular on TV, more for her traditional recipes and traditional way of cooking, whereas Fanny was known to add a bit of glamour and a bit of spice, if you like. Again, when Delia came around, Delia wanted to style herself in contrast to Fanny Cradock and be more down to earth and more home economist in style. So I guess the TV cooks were always trying to flip and be different to each other. I don't think that Fanny and Zena ever knew each other. So they didn't work in the same studios. For example, Zena worked at Alexandra Palace, and Fanny worked at Lime Grove. So I'm not sure that they would have come into contact with each other, but they would have seen each other as very different at the time.
People ask about her books, whether any are still available. I mean, I'm guessing probably none of them are in print, but are they reasonably easy to find?
Yes, I mean,
maybe ebooks or whatever.
Unbelievably, none of her books are available in print, but they are available in second-hand bookshops, on auction sites or online, and from libraries. So libraries have a huge collection of her fiction, particularly. One of the links that will come round is a link to my own website where I've compiled a bibliography, and it's the first bibliography ever of Fanny Craddock's work, detailing all 100+ books. So if you go there, you'll find them. But if you search around, you'll be able to find her books. But none of the original books are reprinted. I'm on a bit of a campaign to republish some of the recipes, and I actually published my own version of her Christmas book as well last year, just to bring some of her recipes and books back a little bit. But her original books are the ones to track down, but secondhand.
Yeah, I didn't know anything about the travel books. An anonymous person has asked, can you tell us some of the useful phrases from her travel books?
Well, they're phrases of the time. I haven't got one to hand, but they're phrases like, could you draw me a bath? And I would like the papers in the morning. Things that were quite elaborate and quite aspirational, but I guess were probably quite useful if you were traveling around Europe at the time.
Yeah, I mean, you needed to be fairly wealthy to be going on holiday to Europe in 1948 or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was the clientele, I guess, for her books. But the books were hugely popular. I mean, people really were starting to love travel and wanting to travel. But people read the books who didn't necessarily travel to the countries as well, because she was so good at just giving a flavour of what the countries were like.
Okay. Oh, there's one after my own heart here. Someone's asked, did she ever comment on the Fanny Haddock and Daphne Whitethigh on Round the Horn? Did she ever comment on that?
No, and she didn't. It's funny, I guess, going back to right at the beginning of my presentation, I talked about some of those associations that people have with when you mention the name Fanny Cradock, and most of them are myths and stories and jokes and things that happened, people impersonating her, whether it was Benny Hill or whether it was on Round the Horn, and she didn't really comment on them, and in good ways or bad ways, but I think she would be delighted secretly that people were doing that, because it meant that people knew who she was. And lots of people say, oh, I remember Benny Hill doing Fanny Cradock or the Fanny Haddock stuff, and she didn't care as long as anyone remembered her. And so she had a really good sense of humour, and a good sense of humour about herself, but she didn't tend to comment on things like that. So she never really made any comments about Gwen. She never really made any comments about her cooking competitions. She just let the commentary happen around her, and acted as a celebrity who was above discussing that. I think if she was around now, she would probably be on Twitter 24/7 and be commenting about everything. But at the time, she was happy for people to talk about her and to laugh about her.
It has to be flattering being impersonated on the biggest radio show out there. Just to interrupt this, for those who aren't fans of Round the Horn, and I'm guessing a lot of people watching this will be of the right age, we do, coming up in April, we have a talk on Kenneth Williams, so that's something to look forward to. Karchi has just said it's not quite familiar with the term part work. Could you clarify it for me?
Sorry.
It's a magazine thing, but they've long gone now, haven't they? Part work.
Yeah, so it's a series of magazines that are published every week that come together, and you put the different parts together into volumes to create almost like encyclopedias, if you like. So, I mean, I think they still do them in some form today for things like, I don't know, railways and stamp collecting and things like that. So you purchase these magazines which start off at a very reasonable price and end up not being so, but you're hooked in, and you have to really buy each one for the coming weeks. So Fanny's Part Work was due to be a series of 96 weekly publications, but it stopped after 80 because sales were dwindling. But most people seem to buy at least the full 80, and the sets, it's called the Fanny Cradock Cookery Programme, still pop up from time to time on auction sites, and are really fun. They're really illustrated well with enormous amounts of full colour photography. So a photographer practically lived with her for 2 years, taking the photos of the food and the wild and wacky presentations that are included. So sorry, yeah, that's what a part was.
Kadri understand. She says sort of serialized. Thank you. Yes, I remember them from my childhood, that you'd send off for a binder and stuff, and it was quite a sort of thing then. Somebody's Amy cooking question. Quite often we hear from forage ingredients in pre-war cookbooks, hedgehogs, I guess, but they drop off quite quickly in the 1940s. Did she use wild ingredients after the hedgehogs?
She didn't actually, but she was really. I'm trying to wrap my brains. Did she or didn't she? She was a huge proponent of using local produce, certainly, but she wasn't really into foraging after that time. And I guess she acknowledged that that was a huge part of wartime cookery, but part of her cookbooks as she moved on was to encourage people to buy products really ultimately, and to make good use of shops. She sold things herself. She sold ready-made puff pastry to anyone that wanted to buy it. You just had to send her a postal order and she would send you some back. So she wasn't really into foraging, and she wanted people, I guess, to be able to, wherever they were in the country, buy products that they could use in the dishes that she made. So whether that was by mail order or in their local corner shops, those were the types of products that she preferred.
Yes, it's interesting. I was just looking just before the show on the Fanny Craddock Cooks invites you to dinner or something. One of the things on the BBC iPlayer, and she certainly had a big enough house and garden that you'd think she might have done the sort of Nigel Slater, let's go out and pick some mint and come back and things. But she didn't do that. She didn't use fruit and veg from her own garden then. No,
she didn't. I mean, she did. She grew a lot of fruit and veg that she used, and she cooked with it on TV and in her books. She had some unusual gardening ways as well, and she encouraged anyone who visited her house, if they were staying overnight, to she used to put a bedpan under their bed and insist that they use that instead of the toilet when they woke up in the morning. And she used their their produce. She called it Madam's tonic to water her tomatoes. She finds it particularly good for her tomato crops and any vegetables that she grew. So perhaps she wouldn't really want to be eating her produce. I'm not sure.
Yes, that must be some sort of strange wartime thing. People have been praising her recipes in the chats. People have been praising the Madeira cake and Yorkshire pudding. And Nanette says, what recipes do you have that you particularly recommend?
Yeah, so definitely some of those. Things that work particularly well, I guess, from Fanny Cradock are things like her recipe for a Swiss roll. So she was very proud of her Swiss roll. She called it the Swiss roll that never cracks. And she had a very different technique, I guess, to producing that Swiss roll. So check that one out. It always works. But things like choux pastry, she was very good at. And she liked to do. So if you like choux buns, whether they're sweet or savoury, then her recipe and her technique, again, which is very different, works really well. So all sorts of recipes like that. She I don't know, I just love all her recipes, really. I don't eat meat, so I skip out all the meaty dishes, but she cooked a fair deal for vegetarians too. But she loved cakes, things like that particularly work really well from her recipes. But you know, dive into some of her recipes and give them a go. You'll find that they work well.
Yeah, I'm a vegetarian too, so I'm guessing that probably wasn't something she had a lot of sympathy with. Am I?
Well, she produced a couple of vegetarian cookbooks in the 1950s, but it wasn't because she loved vegetarians. It was simply because I guess vegetables were quite abundant again after the war, so people were growing things at home and were becoming a bit more available, and she wanted to capitalise on that. She did some vegetarian recipes later and some on screen, but she preferred like classic French dishes, which were quite meat heavy.
Someone's asking about quite a few people are interested in the Atlantis thing. Was she involved in spiritualism or theosophy at all?
She was, yeah, and it was a huge part of her life. And actually, it was one of the careers that she tried to get into later in life, and failed. She set herself up as a psychic healer in the 1970s, and she claimed that she herself had been healed psychically when she contracted cancer in the 1960s. And she constructed a hugely elaborate story of how a psychic healer had saved her life, and that she wanted to then pass that on to other people. She hooked up with some psychic healers from America, and she wanted to bring them over to the UK and do shows with them and things like that. It didn't quite work out in that way, and her stories about being healed from cancer herself were mostly fantasy too, but again were good stories and appeared in the press, and she talked about them on chat shows as well. So if you watch her appearance on Parkinson, she talks about her cancer scare and her way of dealing with it, if you like. So yeah, she was very much.
Yeah, Joanne says, I agree, she was a great cook. I learned from her 70s part work, which I still have. There's a few people asking about what happened at the end of her life. Someone's asked where she lived in Ireland. Sally Young says, could you round off, please, and let us know where and when she finally ended up? And I guess it ties in with the question about, did Fanny and Johnnie ever marry?
Okay, so in Ireland they lived near Cork, actually. It was a place called Doneraile, and it was a place that she chose because she could fly from Cork airport back into London to do some TV work, or on to Europe to do some travel pieces for Nationwide. She wasn't meant to enter the UK at all because she was in tax exile in Ireland. But at that time, I guess people didn't really track you too much, so she was able to do that. But she loved living in Doneraile, and actually I was there myself a couple of years ago, and I spoke to a few people. It's just a very small village in Ireland, and people still recalled her floating about, doing her shopping, barking at people, and generally causing a bit of a nuisance. So she's quite famous still in Doneraile. Fanny and Johnnie, yes, they did get married eventually in 1977. And as usual with Fanny Cradock, it was quite an unusual story. So they went off to a registry office to get married. They both lied about their age on the certificate. They both gave false information. And actually at the time, Fanny was still married to one of her previous husbands. She thought that he had died. Johnnie had seen a newspaper article which named him and said that he died, but it turned out to be the wrong one. So she famously became a bigamist. Her previous husband, who was still alive, died shortly after she got married to Johnnie in 1977. She said, thankfully, which meant that she wasn't prosecuted for that bigamy. But yeah, they were married eventually. But by that point, they'd already lived together for 40 years as husband and wife. She had quite a sad end to her life, and she suffered greatly with her mental health, and friends speculate that possibly she had dementia in later life. She tried to carry on with her careers, but she eventually ended up in a care home in England because she wasn't able to look after herself, and she was found by some fans living in some quite poor conditions that brought around that decision. So she ended her days there and out of the spotlight, really. She spent her last few years away from the cameras.
There's a couple of questions. James Sharples and Ali Middleton both want to know, was she rich? Or did she seems like the sort of person who might have been quite extravagant.
Yeah, she was. I mean, she had a fear of not being rich, and I think it stemmed from her father's bankruptcy. So she was always determined to be earning and to have some investments, if you like. She was very canny with money. I think that TV and TV cooks in the 50s, 60s, 70s didn't earn the sort of millions perhaps that they earn today, but she was fairly well paid, and she was really sharp at negotiating her contracts with the BBC. But it wasn't a huge salary that she had, but she supplemented that career with all her writing, and she carried on writing newspaper columns up until the 1980s too. So she always had 3 or 4 different careers going on. She invested a lot of money in property, and she bought her original house in Kensington, upgraded to one in Greenwich, upgraded to the one that you can see in the TV show that you mentioned in Watford, sold that, downsized to Ireland, downsized into smaller places. So she always had money around her. When she died, she didn't have a huge amount of money. Her will left some money to some friends who'd helped her, and also to some animal charities who still benefit today from her will. But she wasn't fantastically rich, but she certainly wasn't poor either. And she would always appear that she was more affluent than she was, I guess.
Suzanne asks, when did she change her name to Fanny?
When did she change her name?
Yeah. Or when did it become her name? Because it's it's quite a sort of cook name. I mean, it's quite a
So I mean, it's difficult to know because she created such a persona around Fanny Cradock, but she switched professionally to use the name Fanny in the 1950s. She had a TV show on ITV called Fanny's Kitchen, and it was starring Phyllis Cradock. So, I'm not sure if it was a name that people used for her, a name that she liked, or a name that more probably she knew was funny and she knew was memorable, much more memorable than Phyllis. She'd already gone by several other names by that point, as I've demonstrated, I guess. So Frances and Phyllis, her friends called her Phil, quite markedly. Johnnie called her Jill. So she always went by different names, but the name Fanny stuck and came into use, I guess, in the 1950s on TV, but not until the 1970s in her books and written work.
Someone anonymous is saying, asking about her relationship with Barbara Cartland, who you mentioned. I think they've been quite overpowering together. I mean, all that pink and makeup and stuff. But what was their relationship? Did they know each other through the writing?
Yeah, they knew each other fairly well, and you know they both classed each other and referred to each other as friends. I think you know Fanny didn't have very many friends, and she particularly didn't have very many female friends. So the fact that she name checked Barbara Cartland as a friend was probably something quite significant. They had a very competitive friendship. So Barbara Cartland liked to write lots of books. So did Fanny, and she wanted to write more than Barbara and better and sell more. Barbara Cartland also tried to break into cookbooks and produced lots of pink themed cookbooks as well, and you know kind of relished that competitive friendship, I guess, with Fanny Cradock. They weren't close friends, but you know they talked about each other on chat shows a lot and things like that. You know, I think they quite liked to be connected, but they weren't you know popping out for afternoon tea together or anything like that.
Quite a few people are asking about her children. Were any of them involved in her career at all? And have you been in contact with any of them?
Yeah, so both her sons are have died in recent years. They were both involved at various points in her career. So when she initially gave both her sons back to their father's family when she was quite young and when they were young, it was on strict terms that she would have no contact with them until they were 21. But they both reappeared in her life when they became 21 and worked with her. So one of her sons worked on some of the travel books with her and helped behind the scenes. Another son helped to plan events and acted almost as a kind of manager and caterer, if you like, with those. But she had very difficult relationships with both of them and with their families. I have been in touch with their families, and they've contributed to my book. So her granddaughter and her daughter-in-law very much were part of Fanny's career too, although her granddaughter never met her. So they were involved to some extent and in and out, but they had a very uneasy relationship, I guess, with each other.
Okay, I think we're going to have to sort of slightly wrap it up here. Before I go to the last questions, I'll just tell people that we do have quite a lot of other talks coming up. So, as I said, we have one on Kenneth Williams, we have one on David Niven, we have one on James Mason, we have a couple on beekeeping, we have lots of local history talks. So when you'll get an email after this with links to our Eventbrite pages. So please do have a look at that. So I mean, it's really great to be able to have people from all over the country, which was not something we'd have thought of doing before COVID. So Kevin and I are 300 miles away. So a couple of questions. Okay, somebody, and I'm sorry, I'm scrolling up and down the questions. Those people who are looking at them can see there's quite a lot. So someone's asked how you first got interested, and somebody else has pointed out that you seem to have quite a lot of memorabilia, Fanny memorabilia. So David's saying, what's your favourite piece of Fanny memorabilia, and how did you get interested in her in the first place?
So I probably became most interested, I guess, sadly, when she died. So it was 27 years ago that she died in 1994. I remember Fanny Cradock. I grew up in the 70s, so I remember her on chat shows and game shows, and in press and in discussion. But I guess it was when she died that I became particularly fascinated with her, and there was a bit of a smear campaign against her when she died. People said that she was dreadful and couldn't cook, and all this kind of stuff. And I became fascinated with that side of her character, but also it didn't really match with this woman who'd cooked on TV and written all these books and things. So I wanted to find out more about her, and you can probably tell the more I find out about her, the more fascinated I become. Yes, I do have a lot of memorabilia. Probably my favourite thing, gosh, it's really hard to pick one thing out, but I have a Christmas card that she sent to one of her assistants in the 1960s. And I interviewed the assistant for my book, and Wendy, and thanks, Wendy, if you're there. And Wendy insisted that I have this Christmas card to take away, and it's got a lovely picture of Fanny and Johnnie together, and they've signed it, and it's a nice piece of Fanny's history, if you like, but also the history of my book and my connection with the people that worked and knew Fanny Cradock.
Well, there's comments things still coming in. We have a viewer from Australia. There's people really saying how much they've learned, and also how they're really looking forward to actually trying some of the recipes. Kevin is on. You're on Twitter, aren't you? I mean, Kevin is. I'm sure he'll be answering. He can answer any other questions that you've got, because we always find this after the talks. People are still trying to learn things. So, I'll say thank you very much to Kevin. This has been like a really illuminating talk, and I know everyone has really enjoyed it. So thank you very much.
Oh, well, listen, thank you. It's been a pleasure.